March 1945. World War II was drawing to a close, at least on paper. Nazi Germany was about to collapse in Europe, but in the Pacific, Japan was still fighting like a cornered beast, ready to kill before it fell. The American generals knew that to force the surrender of the Japanese Empire, they would need to invade the archipelago itself. But that would be a massacre. Japan was made up of hundreds of mountainous islands, protected by fanatical soldiers, hidden caves, and a civilian population, poisoned by years of imperial propaganda. Then came the hardest choice of the war, Okinawa, an isolated island south of mainland Japan. It looked small on the map, but it hid what strategists feared most: hostile terrain, entrenched troops, and nearly 500,000 civilians mixed among soldiers. Why Okinawa? Because it was the last step before mainland Japan. It was from there that Allied planes could go straight to bomb Tokyo. It was from there that tanks and troops could launch the final offensive. In other words, Okinawa was the gateway to the heart of Japan, and it was locked with blood. But there was a much bigger problem than geography. The Japanese knew this too, and they were ready to turn that island into a slaughterhouse. Jagged mountains, underground caves, interconnected tunnels. It was like fighting an invisible enemy that emerged from the ground, fired, and disappeared. What's more, there was no clear line between soldiers and civilians. Children carried grenades. Women spied on enemy positions. The entire island was a living trap. The American command called the mission Operation Iceberg, an ironic name, since what appeared on the surface was only the tip of the horror. What lay beneath, what was hidden in the belly of that island, was pure hell. The men knew anyone who set foot in Okinawa would hardly come out unscathed. And yet they went. And yet they went. At dawn on April 1st, 1945, the Pacific sky was filled with ships, planes, and a tension that could be cut with a knife. More than 2,500 vessels, including aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, and transport ships, were advancing toward Okinawa, forming the largest naval invasion force in human history. It was the beginning of Operation Iceberg. On deck, the young faces of the Marines and Army men reflected a mixture of fear and determination. Many had survived Iwo Jima, Saipan, or Guadalcanal. Others were about to smell death for the first time. They knew that Japan would not surrender easily. They knew that this landing would not be like the one in Europe. In the Pacific, there was no honor in surrender. Ahead of them was Okinawa. The island looked peaceful in the distance, surrounded by green hills and wide beaches, as if nothing there had been touched by war. But beneath the earth, the Japanese waited, camouflaged, silent, ready. The landing began early with massive air support. Bombers dropped tons of explosives on the coastal slopes and caves, while naval guns roared like metallic thunder, spitting fire towards the interior of the island. At 8:30 a.m., the first Marines stepped onto the beach. They expected fierce resistance, machine guns spitting bullets, mines, mortars, but there was nothing, only silence. The initial advance had been too fast. Within hours, the Americans had taken Kadena Airport and cut the island in half. It seemed easy. It seemed strange. But the veterans knew when the enemy doesn't shoot, it's because he's waiting. In fact, the Japanese had completely changed their strategy. Instead of trying to prevent the landing, they retreated to the south of the island, where they had built a veritable underground labyrinth of tunnels, bunkers, and pillboxes. The Battle of Okinawa would not take place on the beach. It would take place inland. As American soldiers celebrated the peaceful landing, down below beneath the Shuri Hills, General Mitsuru Ushijima smiled silently. He knew that the real battle had not even begun yet. And he was right. In the days following the landings, American forces divided Okinawa into two fronts. To the north, a swift sweep with light resistance, sporadic ambushes, and little organized fighting. But to the south, there was the dark heart of the island, the Japanese defense line, buried underground like a poisonous snake ready to strike. It was a meticulously planned trap. General Ushijima had transformed the mountainous terrain of the southern island into an invisible fortress. The center of this nightmare was the region of Shuri, a chain of seemingly harmless hills, but which hid kilometers of interconnected tunnels, machine gun nests, camouflaged cannons, and perfectly positioned observation posts. It was like facing a phantom enemy, one that saw everything, shot with deadly accuracy, and disappeared without a trace. The American soldiers, confident after landing, soon realized that the hell they had expected had not been avoided. It had merely been postponed. As they attempted to advance southward, they were met with coordinated fire from seemingly non-existent positions. Japanese artillery exploded out of nowhere. Snipers hiding in caves hit targets hundreds of meters away. Grenades flew from unseen holes in the ground. Every meter gained cost, blood, sweat, and lives, and the worst, there was no way to flank the enemy position. The Shuri Hills were connected by tunnels that allowed the Japanese to move quickly and safely from one point to another. Each time a position was taken, the Americans were attacked from behind hours later. It was like fighting inside a maze of concrete and darkness, and for every position destroyed, it seemed like two new ones appeared. It was exhausting, it was frustrating, and it was just the beginning. American commanders soon realized that to take Okinawa, it was not enough to occupy the island's surface. They would have to bury your men to the bone, clear the way with dynamite, flamethrowers, and underground explosions. The war was now fought within the land, and each cave hid a piece of hell. As the ground turned to mud and bodies began to pile up among the blood-soaked stones, a new kind of terror emerged, coming from heaven. The Japanese, aware that they could not win on land, launched the most desperate weapon in their arsenal against the American fleet, the kamikazes. They called them tokotai, the special attack units. Young pilots, some under 20, were trained not to return, but to die. Their missions were simple and lethal. Fly straight at Allied ships with planes loaded with bombs and fuel until they explode on impact. Throughout April and May 1945, more than 1,900 kamikaze attacks were launched against the American fleet in what became known as Operation 10 Go, a final attempt by Japan to turn the tide by using sacrifice as a weapon. The seas around Okinawa became the scene of aerial carnage. The skies were constantly blaring with sirens, attack warnings, and screams of warning. Sailors looked up and saw death plummeting down at high speed, trails of smoke and the sun reflecting off wings that would never return. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, battleships, everyone was a target. The aircraft carrier Bunker Hill was hit by two kamikazes in less than 30 seconds. The ship turned into a ball of fire with hundreds dead and injured. The USS Lafay withstood the impact of 4 kamikazes and 6 bombs in a single attack, and still did not sink. It became known as the ship that didn't want to die. But many others were not so lucky. Every day, the sea around the island became redder, strewn with wreckage, bodies, and burning oil. It was a floating hell, a graveyard on the waves. The kamikazes did not just cause physical destruction, they undermined morale, instilled fear, panic, and uncertainty. How do you fight someone who doesn't want to live? How do you defend yourself against an enemy who smiles before exploding against your hull? The sea, which was once a refuge for rest and reorganization, had become yet another battlefield. There was no peace anywhere, neither on Earth, nor in the sky, nor in the ocean. Okinawa was becoming, little by little, the symbol of Japanese despair and of the endless brutality of that war. In the south of the island, as kamikazes turned the sky into mass suicide, ground fighting reached a new level of horror. The Japanese defensive line seemed endless, hill after hill, cave after cave, always armed to the teeth. But among all the positions, defended by General Ushijima's men, one stood out as the true heart of darkness, the feared Monte Sugarloaf. It was a seemingly ordinary hill, barely 50 meters high, but its strategic position allowed a full view of the surrounding battlefield. Whoever controlled Sugarloaf controlled access to the Shuri Hills, and the Japanese knew it. For days, the Marines had been trying to take that hill. What followed was a nightmare that seemed to have been ripped from the very gates of hell. The Japanese had tunneled into the hill, built concealed bunkers on the slopes, and camouflaged their positions with perfection. For every shot fired, there was an ambush waiting. For every advance, a barrage of mortar fire and machine gun fire responded with fury. The ground turned to mud, then turned to blood, then it turned to a swamp of bodies. Attempts to take Sugarloaf followed one another for 3 days and 3 nights. It was hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, grenades, flamethrowers, and bare hands. The men slept for minutes with their eyes open. Many, driven mad, shouted non-existent orders or simply fell to their knees, laughing amid the explosions. The heat was stifling. Tropical rain turned everything to mud. Bloated corpses piled up in the surrounding valleys. The living stumbled over the dead and often hid beneath them. And still, no one retreated. The Japanese, determined to die there. The Americans, determined not to let that stop them. Sugarloaf was finally conquered, but the cost was absurd. More than 2,600 Marines were injured. Hundreds died, and the worst part, that was just one of the dozens of hills that still protected the heart of Okinawa. Victory on that hill brought no relief. It brought only the certainty that the road to Japan's surrender would be paved with human flesh. Okinawa was not a battle, it was a slaughterhouse. As the fighting for Sugarloaf and the surrounding hills dragged on in an endless cycle of blood, mud, and screams, something even more disturbing began to emerge on the battlefield: the presence of civilians. Okinawa was not an uninhabited island. On the contrary, about 400,000 civilians lived there before the arrival of the armies. Men, women, children, peasants, teachers, elders, all were thrust into the war as if they were soldiers. Not by choice, but by order of the Japanese imperial regime. The empire's propaganda had been clear. Americans were monsters, rapists, torturers, cannibals. The pamphlet said that surrender was worse than death. That capture was an eternal dishonor, that the only way out was to die with dignity or kill the enemy with one's own hands. Many civilians were given grenades and told to blow themselves up if they approached American soldiers. Others were forced to dig trenches and tunnels under threat of execution. Children were trained to carry ammunition or scout enemy positions. And many indeed, were simply used as human shields. As the Americans advanced, they encountered not only soldiers shooting, but women running with explosives strapped to their bodies, parents holding their children and begging for a quick death, girls hiding in caves, hungry, terrified, injured, and afraid to ask for help. What followed was one of the most tragic chapters of World War II mass suicides. On the cliffs south of the island, hundreds, perhaps thousands of civilians jumped to their deaths. Entire families, hand in hand, threw themselves over the rocks. Many were encouraged by Japanese soldiers. Others were threatened. Some were deceived. They were told they would be shot or tortured if they survived. The only way out, they were told, was if you play. There are reports of mothers hugging their children and jumping without hesitation. Caves where dozens of bodies were found, blown up by hand grenades. Echoes of prayers, cries, laments in Japanese muffled by explosions. And the American soldiers, when they came across these scenes, were in shock. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to be like this for civilians to die. But in Okinawa, nothing followed the rules of traditional warfare. There was no line between combatant and innocent. There was no honor, no truce, no sanity. It was an all-out, dirty, desperate war, and everyone was caught in it, even those who had never held a weapon. With the advance of American troops and the gradual collapse of Japanese defenses, the nature of the battle has become almost primitive. It was no longer a war between armies. It was a fight for survival in the midst of a hallucinatory nightmare. The rain began to fall, and with it came the mud. Tropical typhoons swept across the island in the midst of the battle. The earth, once dry and hard, crumbled beneath the soldiers' feet. The trenches turned into brown rivers filled with fetid water. The battlefields, now flooded, dragged bodies, debris, equipment and blood into a grotesque and sick broth. There was no longer any solid ground. Boots sank ankle deep. Soldiers slipped as they carried the wounded. Trucks sank. Artillery got stuck. Tents collapsed in the wind, and mud soaked everything. Uniforms, rifles, bandages, letters from home. The emotional toll was crushing, and everywhere, the bodies. The tropical heat accelerated decomposition. Rats fought with vultures for the remains. The smell of death permeated every breath, every sip of water, every bite of food. Many soldiers stopped eating. Others vomited while on patrol. The stench was inescapable. Those who were still fighting, if you could call it fighting, they did it almost automatically. Their eyes glazed, their muscles trembling. Several had nervous breakdowns. Some laughed uncontrollably. Others cried like children in the midst of gunfire. There are reports of soldiers cowering among corpses, begging to go home. Okinawa was breaking men from within. With each advance, what was left was a mixture of mud and blood. Hills seemed to dissolve into flesh. Weapons jammed in the mud. Time itself seemed to go crazy, with hours that seemed like days, and days that passed in blank, as if nothing else existed but the sound of gunfire, the cold mud, and the weight on our shoulders. It was like fighting inside purgatory, and yet they kept going. Because stopping meant dying, because turning back was not an option, because the goal, Okinawa, had not yet been achieved. But everyone knew deep down that the island was no longer a territory to be conquered. It was a tomb, and they were fighting inside it. The Shuri Line, the impregnable heart of the Japanese defense in Okinawa. After weeks of relentless and bloody fighting, the Japanese defensive line in the Shuri area, which had previously seemed an impregnable fortress, began to show visible cracks. The relentless pressure from American forces, combined with overwhelming air and naval bombardments, had worn down the enemy defenses and worn down their exhausted soldiers. The Battle of Okinawa, which began on April 1st, 1945, quickly became one of the most brutal and costly engagements of World War II, and the epicenter of this carnage was the Shuri Line, the engineering of death, Shuri's fortress. Shuri was much more than a battlefield. It was a masterpiece of Japanese defensive engineering, a maze of interconnected underground tunnels, hidden hillside bunkers, and intricate networks of pillboxes that allowed the Japanese to hold out for weeks on end, even under heavy fire. Shuri Castle, a former royal palace, and a symbol of Okinawan culture, served as the headquarters of the Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. From there, a web of fortifications stretched for miles, taking advantage of the rugged topography of the southern island. These tunnels were not just hiding places, they were veritable dens of death, designed to maximize enemy casualties and prolong resistance. Soldiers moved silently through secret passages, launched surprise attacks through camouflaged openings, and disappeared into the darkness to reappear at another point along the front line, keeping constant pressure on the Americans. The defensive positions were constructed of tree trunks, concrete and rocks, and were virtually impervious to conventional bombardment. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery were strategically positioned to cover every inch of ground, creating deadly crossfire zones. The Japanese strategy was simple: inflict as many casualties as possible, exhaust the enemy, and buy time so that mainland Japan could prepare for the final invasion. The American siege, a meter-by-meter struggle. But as time went on, the American siege closed inexorably. The Allies' superiority in numbers and technology began to take its toll. American artillery forces, which had fired tens of thousands of shells into the Shuri area, caused partial cave-ins, blocking passages and reducing the defenders' mobility. Aircraft dropped incendiaries and napalm, turning the forests and caves into veritable flaming infernos, forcing the Japanese out of hiding. Marines and army soldiers, armed with flamethrowers, explosives and excavation equipment, advanced slowly, clearing the barricades and clearing the tunnels one by one. Every meter gained by the Americans came at a high price in lives and morale. Japanese resistance, though fierce and determined, was no longer sufficient to stem the advance. Shortage of supplies, extreme fatigue, mounting casualties, and the progressive isolation of positions were undermining the morale of the enemy troops. The Japanese doctrine of 09-36 non-surrender, combined with the lack of hope of reinforcements, led many Japanese soldiers to fight to the death, turning every engagement into a bloodbath. The ultimate sacrifice, General Mitsuru Ushijima and seppuku. At the center of this nightmare was General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese forces in Okinawa and a symbol of samurai resistance. A man of deep honor and discipline, Ushijima knew that defeat was imminent. Surrender was not an option for him. He preferred an honorable death to living under the shame of capture, following the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, which valued loyalty and sacrifice above all else. Ushijima had instructed his troops to fight to the last man, and he himself was determined to follow the same fate. On June 22, 1945, as the Japanese positions collapsed and the last defenses were taken at Shuri, Ushijima and his aide, General Isamu Cho, committed seppuku, the ancient samurai suicide ritual. With calm and determined gestures, Ushijima ended his life, making it clear that his commitment to the code of Bushido was absolute to the end. The news of the general's death had a profound impact on his soldiers. Many of them, following the example of their commander, chose to fight to the last bullet, to their last breath, refusing to surrender. The samurai spirit, even crushed by American numerical and technological superiority, remained intact in the minds and actions of these men, resulting in even more fanatical resistance and even greater casualties on both sides. The price of victory and the lessons of Okinawa. The formal surrender of the Japanese forces on Okinawa came only after the last pockets of resistance had been eliminated. However, the price of this victory was immense and painful for both sides. The American forces suffered more than 2,500 dead and some 38,000 wounded. For them, Okinawa was the most costly battle of the Pacific War, both in human and psychological terms. Many veterans described the island as a nightmare that haunted their memories for the rest of their lives, a place where death was omnipresent, where the line between friend and foe was blurred by the brutality of urban and underground warfare, and where human life seemed to have lost all value. On the Japanese side, the losses were even more devastating. Some 110,000 soldiers and civilians were killed. The civilian population of Okinawa was tragically drawn into the maelstrom of all-out war, suffering massacres, mass suicides, and the complete destruction of their homes and villages. The island was reduced to rubble, a grim testament to the ferocity of the conflict. Okinawa was more than just a battle. It was a bloody foreshadowing of what Japan would face if the Allies chose to invade the mainland. The brutality of the fighting, the desperate determination of the Japanese to resist the death, and the massive destruction of the island convinced American leaders that an invasion of the Japanese mainland, Operation Downfall, would cost millions of lives on both sides. Casualty estimates for an invasion of mainland Japan were staggering, far exceeding the already high losses on Okinawa. The prospect of a mainland-scale Okinawa was unacceptable to President Harry Truman and his advisors. This realization was one of the decisive factors in the decision to use atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just a few months later, in the hope of forcing a quick surrender and avoiding further carnage. The atomic bomb, although controversial, was seen as the only viable alternative to ending the war without even greater bloodshed. Okinawa left scars that transcended the battlefield. Both American and Japanese survivors bore deep trauma, and the island became a grim symbol of the toll of total war, where there are no victors, only survivors, forever scarred by violence, suffering, and loss. In the end, the battle showed the world the limits of human endurance, the savagery that war can reach, and the desperate urgency of finding a path to peace. Non-surrender, the belief in Gyokusai, honorable death, and unwavering loyalty to the emperor drove the Japanese soldiers to fight to the last man, turning every bunker and cave into a point of deadly resistance. The American advance was measured in inches, and every inch was bathed in blood. General Mitsuru Ushijima, the first Okinawan samurai. At the center of this nightmare was General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese forces on Okinawa and a symbol of samurai resistance. A man of deep honor and discipline, Ushijima knew that defeat was imminent. Surrender was not an option for him. An honorable death was preferable to living in shame after capture. Ushijima had planned a defense in depth, avoiding direct confrontation on the beaches and drawing American forces into the mountainous interior of the island, where its underground fortifications and rugged topography could be used to maximize enemy casualties. His strategy, though brutal, was effective in prolonging the battle and inflicting a terrible cost on the Allies. On June 22, 1945, amid the collapse of Japanese positions and the taking of the last defenses at Shuri, Ushijima and his aide, General Isamu Cho, committed their seppuku, the ancient samurai suicide ritual. With calm and determined gestures, Ushijima ended his life, making clear that his commitment to the code of Bushido was absolute to the end. The news of the general's death had a profound impact on his soldiers. Many of them, following the example of their commander, preferred to fight to the last bullet, to their last breath, refusing to surrender. The samurai spirit, even crushed by American numerical and technological superiority, remained intact in the minds and actions of those men, transforming the last days of the battle into a series of desperate and suicidal combats. The price of victory, a legacy of pain and drastic decisions. The formal surrender of Japanese forces on Okinawa came only after the last pockets of resistance had been eliminated. However, the price of this victory was immense and painful for both sides. American forces suffered more than 12,500 dead and some 38,000 wounded. For them, Okinawa was the most costly battle of the Pacific War, both in human and psychological terms. Many veterans described the island as a nightmare that haunted their memories for the rest of their lives, a place where death was omnipresent, where the line between friend and foe was blurred by the brutality of urban and underground warfare. On the Japanese side, the losses were even more devastating. Some 110,000 soldiers and civilians were killed. The civilian population of Okinawa was tragically drawn into the maelstrom of all-out war, suffering massacres, mass suicides, and the complete destruction of their homes and villages. The island was transformed into a wasteland of rubble, a silent testament to the ferocity of the conflict. Okinawa was more than just a battle. It was a bloody harbinger of what Japan would face if the Allies had chosen to invade the mainland. The brutality of the fighting, the desperate determination of the Japanese to resist the death, and the massive destruction of the island convinced American leaders that an invasion of the Japanese mainland, Operation Downfall, would cost millions of lives on both sides. Casualty estimates for an invasion of mainland Japan were terrifying, with projections ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions of deaths and injuries for the Allied forces. and even greater numbers for the Japanese population, including civilians who were expected to put up a fierce resistance. This realization was one of the decisive factors in the decision to use atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just a few months later, in the hope of forcing a quick surrender and avoiding further carnage. The memory of Okinawa, with its fanatical resistance and exorbitant human cost, hung like a shadow over the deliberations in Washington, reinforcing the belief that only an unprecedented shock could break the Japanese will to fight without the need for a devastating ground invasion. Okinawa left scars that transcended the battlefield. Both American and Japanese survivors bore deep trauma, and the island became a grim symbol of the toll of total war, where there are no victors, only survivors forever scarred by violence, suffering, and loss. In the end, the battle showed the world the limits of human endurance, the savagery that war can reach, and the desperate urgency of finding a path to peace. 0939, the Shuri Line, the impregnable heart of the Japanese defense in Okinawa, continued. The Japanese doctrine of no surrender, combined with the overwhelming superiority of American firepower, turned the battle into a meat grinder. Shuri's defenders, though heroic in their obstinacy, were doomed. With each passing day, the siege tightened, and hope of reinforcements or a successful counteroffensive diminished. The island, once a tropical paradise, had been transformed into a hell of mud, blood, and steel, where human life was a cheap commodity. General Mitsuru Ushijima, honor and sacrifice. At the center of this nightmare was General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of Japanese forces on Okinawa and a symbol of samurai resistance. A man of deep honor and discipline, Ushijima knew that defeat was imminent. He had meticulously planned a defense in depth, avoiding direct confrontation on the beaches in order to draw the Americans into the island's fortified interior, where they could be subjected to maximum attrition. His strategy, though brutally effective in terms of Allied casualties, could not, in the end, overcome the vast American superiority in material and numbers. For Ushijima, surrender was not an option. The code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, dictated that an honorable death was preferable to the dishonor of capture. He had ordered his men to fight to their last breath, and he himself would do no differently. On June 22, 1945, as the last Japanese positions collapsed and the final defenses at Shuri were taken, Ushijima and his aide, General Isamu Cho, committed the seppuku, the ancient samurai suicide ritual. With calm and determined gestures, Ushijima ended his life by piercing his abdomen with a short sword, while Cho decapitated him, ensuring a quick and honorable death. This final act of defiance and loyalty to the emperor and country was a testament to the mentality that permeated the Japanese forces. The news of the general's death had a profound impact on his soldiers. Many of them, following the example of their commander, preferred to fight to the last bullet, to their last breath, refusing to surrender. The samurai spirit, even crushed by American numerical and technological superiority, remained intact in the minds and actions of those men, transforming the last days of the battle into a series of desperate and suicidal combats where surrender was seen as the greatest dishonor. Small groups of Japanese soldiers continued to fight for weeks after the official declaration of the end of the battle, hiding in caves and tunnels, emerging only for guerrilla attacks. The price of victory, a legacy of blood and trauma. The formal surrender of Japanese forces in Okinawa came only after the last pockets of resistance had been eliminated on July 2, 1945. However, the price of this victory was immense and painful for both sides, leaving a legacy of blood and trauma that would echo for decades. American forces suffered more than 12,500 dead and some 38,000 wounded. For them, Okinawa was the most costly battle of the Pacific War, both in human and psychological terms. Many veterans described the island as a nightmare that haunted their memories for the rest of their lives. a place where death was omnipresent, where the line between friend and foe was blurred by the brutality of urban and underground warfare. The number of American casualties on Okinawa exceeded the totals killed and wounded on Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal combined, underscoring the unprecedented ferocity of the fighting. On the Japanese side, the losses were even more devastating. Some 110,000 soldiers and civilians were killed. The civilian population of Okinawa was tragically swept into the maelstrom of total war, suffering massacres, mass suicides, and the complete destruction of their homes and villages. The island was reduced to rubble, its landscape disfigured by bomb craters and debris. The collective trauma of Okinawans, who saw their homeland become the scene of unspeakable carnage, would linger for generations, shaping their identity and their relationship with Japan and the United States. Okinawa, the catalyst for atomic decision. Okinawa was more than just a battle. It was a bloody foreshadowing of what Japan would face if the Allies chose to invade the mainland. The brutality of the fighting, the desperate determination of the Japanese to resist the death, and the massive destruction of the island convinced American leaders that an invasion of the Japanese mainland, Operation Downfall, would cost millions of lives on both sides. Conservative estimates put the number of American casualties at more than 1 million, and Japanese casualties, including civilians, at 5 to 10 million in an invasion that could last for years. This realization was one of the decisive factors in the decision to use atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just a few months later, on August 6th and 9th, 1945, in the hope of forcing a quick surrender and preventing further carnage. The Battle of Okinawa, with its exorbitant human toll and demonstration of the ferocity of Japanese resistance, served as a powerful argument for those advocating the use of this terrible new weapon. The logic was grim but pragmatic. Atomic bombs, devastating as they were, could save millions of lives that would have been lost in a prolonged ground invasion. Okinawa left scars that transcended the battlefield. Both American and Japanese survivors bore deep trauma, and the island became a grim symbol of the toll of total war, where there are no victors, only survivors forever scarred by violence, suffering, and loss. In the end, the battle showed the world the limits of human endurance, the savagery that war can reach, and the desperate urgency of finding a path to peace. Okinawa, the invisible scars of a steel typhoon. When the dust finally settled over Okinawa, the island, transformed into an open-air graveyard, offered no space for celebration or relief. The end of the battle did not represent a complete victory. Rather, it represented the beginning of a profound nightmare for the survivors. The real hell was no longer in the explosions and gunfire, but in the silent echoes left in the minds and spirits of those who had endured the horror. The Battle of Okinawa, a conflict that lasted 82 days of uninterrupted carnage, left an indelible mark not only on the physical landscape of the island, but even more profoundly on the psyches of all involved. Soldiers and civilians, victors and vanquished. The psychological legacy of American soldiers, wounds beyond the flesh. For American soldiers, Okinawa was the pinnacle of what war could do to a man. What they witnessed in the endless weeks of combat was more than a succession of battles. It was a constant plunge into death, dehumanization, and barbarity. The intensity of the hand-to-hand combat, the fanatical resistance of the Japanese, the incessant kamikaze attacks, and the sight of civilians committing mass suicide created a scene of horror that few could process. Many returned home physically intact, but with invisible wounds that bled endlessly into their memories. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which at the time was still poorly understood and often misdiagnosed as combat fatigue or battle shock, took a devastating toll on many of these men. They became shadows of their former selves, unable to fully reintegrate into civilian life. Vivid nightmares haunted their nights, with recurring images of fallen friends, distraught civilians, violent explosions, and the pungent smell of burning flesh and blood. Hypervigilance, irritability, and difficulty concentrating were constant companions. Many experienced constant hyperactivity, jumping at the slightest noise, as if danger were always just around the corner, reliving the terror of Japanese surprise attacks or artillery bombardments. Others sank into deep depression, withdrawing from family and friends, turning to alcoholism, or in extreme cases, committing suicide. Stories of veterans who, years later, still relived every minute of the battle as if it were happening right then and there, were common, silent testimonies of a trauma that refused to go away. The lack of recognition and proper treatment for PTSD at the time only compounded the suffering of these men, who were often seen as weak or cowardly by their communities. The devastation of the Okinawa civilian population, a people between two forces. But it was not just the soldiers who bore invisible scars. The civilian population of Okinawa was devastated in ways that went beyond physical and material pain. The island, once home to rice paddies and peaceful villages, was now a field of ruins, where ghosts seemed to roam among the destroyed homes and abandoned bodies. Of the roughly 400,000 people who lived on the island, an estimated 40,000 to 150,000 civilians died, a third of the total population. Many were caught in the relentless crossfire, caught between the lines. Others were killed by Japanese soldiers who viewed them as traitors or spies, or who simply saw them as a hindrance to the defense. The brutality of war spared no one of the darkest and most painful chapters of the Battle of Okinawa was the wave of mass suicides, egged on by Japanese propaganda that American capture would result in torture, rape, and death, and often directly coerced by Japanese soldiers. Thousands of civilians, including entire families, committed suicide by throwing themselves off cliffs, detonating grenades, or drowning themselves. This tragedy, known as gyokusai, honorable killing, left families torn apart and communities devastated with the trauma of loss and coercion, scarring generations. The island was completely devastated, with 90% of its buildings destroyed and the social and economic infrastructure in tatters. The few survivors faced the Herculean task of rebuilding their lives amidst the desolation, carrying with them the weight of loss and indescribable horror. Social and cultural impact, an open wound in Japanese memory. The psychological impact was accompanied by profound social and cultural changes. Okinawa became a grim symbol of the brutality of total war, the absence of moral boundaries, and the human cost of military obstinacy. For Japan, it was a national trauma that resonated for decades, influencing not only military policies, but also popular culture, collective memory, and international relations. The Okinawa experience, where civilians were sacrificed in the name of futile defense, generated a deep sense of abandonment and resentment toward the Japanese central government that persisted for many years after the war. The island, which already had a cultural identity distinct from mainland Japan, found this distinction heightened by the unique suffering it experienced. In the United States, the report of the battle reinforced the understanding that an invasion of mainland Japan would be an even greater slaughter, potentially costing millions of lives on both sides. The images and reports from Okinawa, the fanatical resistance, the kamikaze attacks, the civilian suicides, were brought directly to the White House, shaping the decision to seek alternatives to ending the war without a direct landing. Operation Downfall, the invasion plan for Japan, which predicted millions of Allied and Japanese casualties, became an unbearable prospect in the face of what was witnessed on Okinawa. The battle thus served as a crucial catalyst for the decision to use atomic bombs, seen by many as the only way to avoid a repeat of Okinawa on a continental scale. For the veterans who returned home, the silence and misunderstanding were often as cruel as the war itself. Many felt isolated in their grief, facing a society eager to forget the conflict and move on. Thus, the Battle of Okinawa became one of the darkest and least understood chapters of World War II. An open wound in the history of those involved, a poignant reminder of the unimaginable cost of war and the scars it leaves, visible and invisible for generations. Okinawa was not just a battle won or lost. It was a bitter lesson in the limits of human suffering, in the fragility of life, and in the devastating capacity of war when it ceases to be a conflict between armies and becomes a struggle for existence itself. The Battle of Okinawa, fought from April to June 1945, was not just another bloody engagement in the Pacific theater of World War II. It was a brutal turning point, a terrifying prelude to the end of the conflict. Known to the Allies as Operation Iceberg and to the Japanese as the Steel Typhoon, Tai no Baofeng, Tetsu no Bofu, because of the unprecedented intensity of the fighting and the colossal volume of artillery fire, this battle revealed the unwavering ferocity of Japanese resistance and the unimaginable human cost of an outright invasion of mainland Japan. Its echoes resonated deeply in the corridors of power in Washington, influencing the most controversial decision in modern history, the use of nuclear weapons. The strategic scenario, the island as the last obstacle. By early 1945, the Allied war machine, driven by the United States, was advancing inexorably toward the heart of the Japanese Empire after a series of brutal campaigns on Pacific islands such as Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Peleliu. Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, had emerged as the last major obstacle before Japan. Its strategic location, just 340 miles from the main island of Kyushu, made it an invaluable military objective. Possession of Okinawa would allow the Allies to establish air and naval bases vital for the impending invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall. For the Japanese, Okinawa was the last line of defense. The loss of the island would have exposed mainland Japan to large-scale air and naval attacks. The Imperial Command was aware of Okinawa's strategic importance and prepared for a fanatical defense, mobilizing a force of approximately 120,000 men, including the Japanese 32nd Army under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, and a large number of forcibly conscripted civilians, many of them students. The invasion, a deceptive landing Operation Iceberg, began on April 1, 1945, with the largest amphibious landing in the history of the Pacific. More than 180,000 U.S. Marines and Army soldiers, supported by a vast fleet of over 1,300 ships, including aircraft carriers, battleships, and destroyers, descended on the beaches of Okinawa. The initial surprise was the lack of resistance on the beaches, a stark contrast to previous battles. This apparent ease, however, was a deadly trap. General Ushijima had opted for a strategy of defense in depth, transforming the island's mountainous terrain and natural caves into an impenetrable fortress with interlocking fortified defensive positions designed to inflict maximum casualties on the invaders. Earthly hell, hand-to-hand combat, and fanatical resistance. As American forces advanced inland, the true nature of the Battle of Okinawa revealed itself. The fighting turned into a brutal slaughter, characterized by battles for every inch of ground, amidst labyrinths of tunnels, caves, and underground fortifications. The Japanese soldiers, steeped in the code of Bushido and a belief in honorable death, fought to the last man, often carrying out suicidal banzai charges. At every hill, every cave, every trench, the Americans faced fanatical resistance, which turned every advance into a bloodbath. The rugged terrain and torrential rains turned the battlefield into a morass of mud and death, making it difficult to move troops and equipment. The scourge of the kamikaze, the terror of the skies. While hell was raging on the ground, the skies and seas around Okinawa became the scene of a terrifying new form of warfare: kamikaze attacks. Japanese pilots, in planes packed with explosives, deliberately swooped down on Allied ships, transforming themselves into human missiles. The American fleet suffered devastating losses, with dozens of ships sunk and hundreds damaged. The USS Bunker Hill, an aircraft carrier, was hit by 2 kamikazes in a single day, resulting in hundreds of deaths and injuries. The kamikaze terror not only caused material and human casualties, but also had a profound psychological impact on the Allied aircrew, who lived under the constant threat of a suicide attack. The immeasurable human cost, an unprecedented carnage. The Battle of Okinawa was one of the bloodiest in the history of World War II, with a truly immeasurable human cost. Casualty estimates vary, but the numbers are shocking. US forces, over $82,000. Casualties, including about 12,500 killed or missing and 70,000 wounded. The US Navy suffered more casualties on Okinawa than in any other battle of the war. Japanese forces. It is estimated that over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, with only about 7,000 to 10,000 captured. Many chose suicide rather than surrender, following the orders of their commanders. Okinawa's civilians. The civilian population of Okinawa was devastated. It is estimated that between 40,000 and 150,000 civilians, or 1/3 of the island's population, died during the battle. Many were caught in the crossfire. Others were killed by Japanese soldiers who considered them traitors, and a significant number committed mass suicide, instigated by Japanese propaganda warning them of the atrocities that the Americans would commit. The island was completely devastated, with 90% of its buildings destroyed. Numbers alone cannot convey the scale of the suffering. Accounts from American soldiers describe the landscape of Okinawa as a living hell, with bodies piling up, the smell of death permeating the air, and the constant threat of ambushes and suicide attacks. The battle was a meat grinder, where human life had little value in the face of the fanatical determination on both sides. Okinawa and the atomic bomb decision, a moral and strategic dilemma. The brutality and immeasurable human cost of the Battle of Okinawa had a profound impact on Allied strategic decisions in the final months of World War II. As the last Japanese defenses on the island were crushed, it became clear to American leaders that a direct invasion of mainland Japan would be an even greater catastrophe. The numbers and reports coming out of Okinawa were alarming. If the capture of a relatively small island in the southern part of the archipelago had cost tens of thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives, what about an invasion of the very heart of Japan? Conservative estimates suggested that such an operation, Operation Downfall, could cost millions of lives, both American soldiers and Japanese civilians. The Pentagon estimated that American casualties could reach 1 million, while Japanese casualties, including civilians, could be 5 to 10 million. This prospect horrified American strategists. Among them, President Harry Truman and his military advisors were searching for a way to end the war quickly, decisively, and at the same time minimize Allied losses. It was in this context of desperation and urgency that the most controversial decision in modern history emerged: the use of nuclear weapons. The attack on Okinawa demonstrated in a cruel way that Japan would fight to the last man. The fanaticism, brutality, and disregard for life displayed on that island made it clear that voluntary surrender was unlikely. The Americans sought a way to force a surrender without having to face a devastating invasion that would, in essence, be Okinawa on a continental scale. In August 1945, just 2 months after the fall of Okinawa, atomic bombs were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima, August 6th, and Nagasaki, August 9, causing unprecedented destruction and instantly killing tens of thousands of people. The devastation, combined with the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan, August 8th, finally broke imperial resistance. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender, officially ending World War II. The legacy of Okinawa, an eternal warning. The Battle of Okinawa, with all its ferocity and sacrifice, was the bloody prologue to that outcome. It revealed to the world the immense cost of total war and served as a dire warning of the horrors that could be repeated if the conflict continued. Although controversial, the decision to use the atomic bomb was in part shaped by the memory of the battle, a desperate attempt to prevent more Okinawas, more deaths, and more destruction. Thus, Okinawa remains one of the bloodiest and most decisive episodes of World War II, an eternal lesson in the brutality of war and the price of peace. It is a grim reminder that in times of conflict, the hardest decisions are often made in the shadow of carnage and despair, with consequences that echo for generations. The Battle of Okinawa, a whirlwind of steel and blood that raged across the island between April and June 1945, transcended mere counts of dead and wounded to go down in history as one of the darkest and most decisive chapters of the Second World War. It was not just a military victory, but a bloody epilogue that exposed the unparalleled brutality of total war and indelibly shaped the destiny of humanity. What unfolded on the beaches, in the hills, and in the bowels of Okinawa was a terrifying microcosm of what Japan was willing to endure and inflict in the name of its honor and its emperor. The impregnable fortifications of the Shuri Line, a labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers, bore witness to the fanatical obstinacy of a defense that defied logic. Every square meter of land was fought over with a ferocity that bordered on desperation, turning the island into a meat grinder where human life was a cheap commodity. Japanese resistance personified in the stoic figure of General Mitsuru Ushijima, who preferred the ancestral ritual of seppuku to the dishonor of surrender, sent an unequivocal message to the Allies. The invasion of mainland Japan would be a slaughter of unimaginable proportions, a sacrifice that could cost millions of lives on both sides. But the human cost of Okinawa was not limited to the battlefields. The island's civilian population was drawn into the vortex of war, subjected to massacres, forced to commit mass suicides, and witnessed the annihilation of their home and culture. The psychological and physical scars left on the survivors, both American soldiers and Okinawan civilians, were deep and lasting, a legacy of trauma that would echo for generations. Okinawa became a symbol of the utility of war, the fragility of life, and the human capacity for the most abject cruelty. It was against this backdrop of horror and despair that the Battle of Okinawa became the catalyst for the most controversial decision in modern history: the use of nuclear weapons. Faced with the prospect of an Operation Downfall that promised to be a repeat of Okinawa on a continental scale, with casualties estimated in the millions, the atomic bomb emerged as a terrifying but, for many, necessary alternative. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, distant cities, became the targets of a weapon that, although it would cause unprecedented destruction, was seen as the only way to force Japan to surrender and prevent further the Battle of Okinawa, the legacy of immeasurable sacrifice. Thus, the Battle of Okinawa, the typhoon of steel, was not merely a bloody chapter in the vast tapestry of World War II. It was a brutal turning point, a crucible of suffering and heroism that redefined the boundaries of total war and ultimately shaped the destiny of humanity. From the treacherous beaches, where the apparent calm hid a deadly network of underground defenses, to the claustrophobic bowels of the Shuri Line, every inch of ground was paid at an unimaginable price in blood and souls. The fanatical obstinacy of the Japanese defense, personified in the stoic figure of General Mitsuru Ushijima and his final act of seppuku, revealed a determination that defied military logic, transforming the island into a meat grinder, where human life was a cheap commodity. The human cost of Okinawa transcended cold statistics. For American soldiers, the island became a living nightmare, a place where the brutality of hand-to-hand combat, the constant threat of kamikaze bombs, and the sight of civilian despair left deep, invisible wounds that would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder, still unnamed and uncomprehended, took the peace from many who survived physically intact. For the civilian population of Okinawa, the battle was an apocalyptic catastrophe, a forced genocide in which thousands were slaughtered, forced into mass suicide, or simply crushed between the belligerent forces. The island, once a paradise, was reduced to rubble, a monument to the futility of war and the human capacity to inflict suffering. But it was precisely this unprecedented slaughter that forced the Allied leaders to confront a terrible truth: a direct invasion of mainland Japan. Operation Downfall would be a continent-wide Okinawa, a bloodbath that would cost millions of lives on both sides. The ferocity of Japanese resistance, the willingness to fight to the last man, woman, and child, made the prospect of an amphibious landing in the heart of the empire untenable. It was in this abyss of desperation and strategic calculation that the most controversial decision in modern history was made: the use of nuclear weapons. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though morally questionable and devastating in their consequences, were in part a direct result of the brutal lessons learned in Okinawa. They represented a desperate attempt to prevent more Okinawas, to spare the millions of lives that would have been sacrificed in a prolonged invasion. Japan's surrender, precipitated by nuclear annihilation and Soviet entry into the war, marked the end of a global conflict, but it left a legacy of ethical dilemmas and deep scars. Okinawa, therefore, stands as a grim and eternal reminder, a testament to the unparalleled brutality of total war, to human resilience and fanaticism, and to the unbearable price of peace. It is a lesson etched in history, a persistent echo of the horrors that can arise when humanity loses its moral compass and gives in to the fury of destruction. May the voices of those who perished in Okinawa and the scars of those who survived serve as a perpetual warning against the folly of war and an unceasing call for the pursuit of peace and understanding among peoples.